Good evening. The Virginia Public Access Project and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University welcome you to After Virginia Votes. Tonight, a retrospective on the 2021 Virginia governor's race. This live broadcast is presented by Cox Communications and made possible by our sponsors: Carilion Clinic, Innova, Mercer Trigiani, Northern Virginia Electric Cooperative, Centera, Town Bank, Jean Marie and Tom Davis, James W. Hazel, Magali and Tom Hurst, Gigi and Shep Miller, Nancy and Edward Rice, Newport News Shipbuilding, Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, the Port of Virginia, Volkswagen Group of America, and viewers like you. Now, please welcome your host and moderator for this evening, NBC4 Northern Virginia Bureau Chief, Julie Carey.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to After Virginia Votes. I'm Julie Carey. I'm the Northern Virginia Bureau Chief for NBC4, and it is my privilege to moderate this unique event organized by the nonpartisan Virginia Public Access Project. We are fortunate tonight to have with us top advisors from both the Glenn Youngkin and Terry McAuliffe campaigns. Our purpose tonight is not to relitigate the governor's race. The voters have spoken. We've asked our guests to check their talking points at the door. Our hope is that this will be a civil conversation between two professionals who are going to provide us some deep insights into the strategic and tactical decisions that were made during the course of the campaign. We're going to save some time, too, for questions that have been submitted ahead of time by the online audience and by the small audience that is in this room. And then later in the program, we'll hear from two distinguished commentators about what Tuesday's result will mean for Virginia going forward. You can also weigh in on the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AfterVAVotes. So before we get started, let's take a look at some data visualizations that are going to give us a common baseline to understand what happened on Tuesday. So let's start first with fundraising. This was Virginia's first ever $100 million plus governor's race. Now, the money contest, it was essentially a draw. When Terry McAuliffe was elected 8 years ago, he outspent his opponent nearly 2-1. This time, though, McAuliffe's legendary Rolodex met its match, and Glenn Youngkin, who came from the private equity world, energized Virginia's Republican donor class and loaned his campaign $20 million. Secondly, let's take a look at voter turnout. Voter participation, as you've probably heard, hit an all-time record, nearly 55% of registered voters. In this chart, localities above the dotted line had higher turnout compared to 2017. Key to the outcome, Youngkin energized his base far more than McAuliffe. In fact, only two localities that had lower turnout were Democratic strongholds of Charlottesville and Portsmouth. Turnout was flat in several cities with concentrations of black voters: Richmond, Norfolk, and Petersburg. So while turnout was up, a red wave washed across Virginia. The size of the circles on this map represent the relative number of voters. The color indicates which way the partisan lean of each locality shifted from 2017. If you look really hard, you can see a single fleck of blue down near the North Carolina border. I don't think I can see it from here. Our fourth visual looks at the trend in party performance over the last three gubernatorial elections. Let's start with a set of rural, predominantly white counties. They all started out red, grew more red during the Trump years, a trend that continued and in some cases accelerated this year. Next up, Northern Virginia. These shifts look more subtle, but the population is so large that even small moves have outsized effects. And finally, let's look at 5 downstate suburban localities, all which became more blue in 2017, then shifted back this year. The red wave last Tuesday splashed over every Virginia locality, with, again, that one exception, tiny Emporia, near the North Carolina line. And our final visual takes a look at the House of Delegates, where Democrats had regained control after nearly 2 decades in the wilderness. Republicans needed 5 seats to tie, 6 to regain control. They flipped 1 in Southwest, 1 in the Fredericksburg area, 2 south of Richmond, 1 in the Peninsula, and finally 2 in Virginia Beach, although as of this evening, still some questions about whether there will be recounts in a couple of those races. So that's a look at our data. I'm joined now by 2 senior advisors to the McAuliffe and Youngkin campaigns, Will Ritter, who served as the media strategist for the Glenn Youngkin campaign, and Michael Halle, the senior advisor to the McAuliffe campaign. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. And I want to say one thing before we move on that's probably obvious. It's a lot easier to be sitting here if you are the winner. So Michael, we
They
really
made us agree to do it no matter what happens.
That's right, that's right. So Michael, we do so appreciate you honoring your commitment to be here tonight, win or lose. Let me start though by finding out a little bit more about both of you. I'd like to hear how long you knew your candidate and what your specific role was in the campaign.
Go ahead. Good.
We'll jump in.
I've got a cute story about it actually. So I've got a 1-year-old son. I got 2 sons. I got one 1-year-old named Ben, and he's exactly as old as long as I've known Glenn Youngkin. Because I know this because I left the hospital after Ben was born and healthy, but there was this guy that we'd been trying to meet with who was thinking about running. He's a Carlisle executive, interesting profile, and we got a call from his people that he wanted to meet that day at our shop pool house in downtown Richmond. So I asked my wife, she said, get out of here, you're not doing anything anyway. Ran and we met this guy who was just, he was a breath of fresh air, and he really seemed with it and like a good speaker and knew his values. So we were excited about it. So starting then and just kept running because, we had to hit the ground running. But that's exactly a year about.
And then your role more specifically?
Oh, sorry, my role. So I'm the media strategist. We were the media vendors for the campaign. So we primarily look at, the data and the polling, and we try to create themes that are going to resonate online, down to digital, down to radio, and put the ads together. We've made over 42 ads for the Youngkin campaign.
Michael?
Michael Halle, great to be here with everybody. I first met Terry in 2013 working on the gubernatorial campaign. And as I think people who know Terry here know that once you're kind of have the bear hug around you, it never lets go, which is a wonderful thing. So have just stayed close with him through the years, and when he was asked to do this again and was excited about making another go at it, I was very excited to be part of it with him. It kind of goes through iterations, but ever since 2013, we worked with him. My job on the campaign was a lot of the jobs that no one else wanted to do.
Which meant?
But it was honestly, it was working really closely with our campaign manager and senior team to develop the larger strategy for the campaign, and then working closely with the different media components and organizing components, and just helping to make sure that as much of that was symbiotic as possible.
Let's use that data presentation to springboard to our first discussion. Looking at turnout, I want to hear from each of you how turnout met your expectations and where you saw surprises in what happened on election night.
Yeah, I think we had an initial benchmark of 3.1 that we revised with maybe 3.1 million, that is. We revised as we got closer to the election to 3.2 because we saw the amount of excitement coming up, but that was basically at 3.2.
Any surprises anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, you saw the map.
Much red?
Yeah, there's been this kind of conventional wisdom, and that, hey, if we, depending on, how the candidacy is hitting with the people, we might, what we pick up in Fairfax, do we lose in Southwest, right? In dark red areas, are people, less inclined because they don't think he's that much of a red meat guy, or that balancing act. But we just didn't see that, and what we saw was our issues were kind of rising, things at different speeds, but it was all kind of going up. So we figured that there would be a big turnout, but also, it's Virginia, it's blue. So we figured any one of the things that the McAuliffe team was doing well could be the thing that just wakes people up in Northern Virginia, and we would just get swamped. So that was, we were constantly keeping an eye on that.
Michael, how about you? Expectations and where you saw best and worst surprises?
So, I mean, I think there are a few components. I mean, if you look at early voting and vote by mail, one of the things that I think, and maybe you guys didn't struggle with, but certainly we struggled with, was there's no baseline for what the expectations should be. So there was 2020, which was the first time those rules were in place, and they were slightly different rules in that you didn't need an excuse and some of these other things. But more importantly, 2017 did not have the same structural system for being able to vote. And 2020 there were a lot of unique factors. The president of the United States at that point was making a big deal of how you voted. It became kind of partisan issue. We were also, importantly, in the middle of a pandemic in a way that was different than this past November 2nd. So understanding what percentage of the overall electorate early vote and vote by mail would make up, I think was tough to peg. In terms of the support margin, I think we had that spot on. So we had a good idea, we knew who those people were. That was obviously got reported every night, and it actually outperformed by about a half point where we expected it to be. I think what we did not anticipate was the level of turnout on election day, and that early voting would make up less than 35% of the overall vote. As the early vote and vote by mail surged at the end, we were expecting it was going to make up a larger proportion. And I think some of the numbers you showed, if you showed that I think it was the second chart that looked at, compared to 2017, a year where the first year the Democrats, after 16 and the shift in presidential power, were as energized as any time I think a lot of us can remember. The idea that we would surpass that turnout in almost every county, the idea that in kind of majority Black and brown areas that usually when in off years like this, those will be the communities where we see turnout drop off right away. The opposite occurred, and so if you showed just those numbers and said, hey, in these Democratic areas, you're going to exceed 2017. I would have slept a lot easier for the few weeks before the election. And I think what certainly I think we didn't expect was that some of the more Republican areas would be performing at near 2020 levels, that there would be significant amounts of presidential year only voters that would turn out. And I think that was probably a very similar, if our seats were shifted in 2017, probably a very similar feeling where there's just kind of this amount of enthusiasm that even when our enthusiasm seemed up, even was able to wash that out.
Interesting. So we know that campaigns take twists and turns with external events. So I want to hear a little bit more about how some key events were processed within the campaign. So we kind of want you to take us inside the room and let us know how it might have influenced the campaign's message or the strategy. I'm not going to put a clock on you here, but we'll try to keep these fairly brief so we can cover a lot of material. So a little bit of a challenge there, and it may be something that it just didn't really land that hard. But let's look first at three events that happened outside of Virginia. The first, January 8th, 2 days after the invasion of the U.S. Capitol, Twitter suspends President Trump's account, a ban that later becomes permanent. And of course, Glenn Youngkin had not even officially declared at that point. So will any ripple, any discussion?
No, not really. To tell you the truth, we were still in the planning stages of putting things together. So obviously we were watching it very closely, but we weren't in a position to have to take a position or comment on it.
I mean, for us, I think it was more of a emotional response as Americans that this is a terrifying moment, and I don't think there was a significant political calculation on January 7th or January 8th about what this would mean. It was more kind of a fear of what had just happened and what that would mean for the country more than what it meant for the race.
Let me ask next about August 16th. So we all watched it during the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. We saw the civilians clinging to the military planes, and then 10 days after that, the suicide bomb at the Kabul airport that killed 13 U.S. troops. And that was also a point at which President Biden's popularity began to go downhill. Michael, let me flip back to you first. How about the impact of that within the campaign? What discussion did it engender?
I mean, I think there was, again, I think in any one of those moments, as much as like people believe that everyone's like, well, what are the numbers on this? Like, let's get a poll and let's see what this is going to. I think there was generally a fear for, and I think there was, anytime you see that happening, there's an emotional visceral response. Terry's campaign manager from 2013 was on the ground in Kabul as that was happening. So there was an emotional component. Terry's son served in the military. So I think there were pieces outside again of politics, which were the initial reaction. In the couple weeks after those events took place, that was I think that was the first and only real shift we saw in our internal polling, where things tightened from 4 or 5 points to just around even, or within the margin of being even, and kind of relatively consistent after that. So I think that it didn't require a lot of discussion to see that things had shifted in terms of the national mood and opinion, and that put us in a place where it was even going to be tighter than we had expected in June.
Will, how about you in your campaign?
Same deal. It was just shocking, and your first thought doesn't go to the politics of it, the benefit. You really would like this to end in a good way, as good as it could. It just seemed to be getting worse and worse. I mean, to put the political hat on, we kind of had a choice to make at that point, which was we had been very clear about running on Virginia issues.
Very local.
And because we had kind of predicted that the McAuliffe campaign would try to nationalize the race because that would work better with his voters. So we were going to try to contrast with that. We also knew that, Democratic celebrities were going to come in, Obama was going to come in. So it's like, what can we do to really focus on Virginia and focus on local issues and make this about like competency as governor? However, then something like Afghanistan happens and you see polling is really starting to drag Terry down. But if we kind of took the bait, or not the bait, but if we try to capitalize on it, then we kind of lost the argument that we're talking about just Virginia. If all of a sudden we're going to try to make an ad about, foreign policy suddenly. So we had a choice to make. We decided to, stick with Virginia issues and kind of stay true to it. I don't think we put a single ad that mentioned Joe Biden on television.
Michael, I know you'll remember this date, September 1st. The U.S. Supreme Court refuses to block a Texas law that bars abortion as early as 6 weeks of pregnancy. That was big news in your campaign.
I think that was. I think it's anytime there's a moment that viscerally puts into perspective for a lot of people what's at stake in a campaign and what it's going to mean in people's lives. I think that was one of those moments where, over the past couple decades, it's been a part of a lot of campaigns, but the Supreme Court has served as this kind of backstop to anything actually changing. I think that was the first piece of evidence. I think there is a question. I hope this, as we move forward from this, people start to engage even more. I mean, you think about, we're seeing a lot of activism at these school board meetings. We're seeing lots of activism around other issues, pertaining to people being upset about something or concerned about something. And I generally hope that moving forward we see more activism around that issue, even beyond where it's been to date, because for people that care about it, there is I'm certain one of them, that is a real risk that stands in front of people, and I think that it brought that into perspective. We didn't see it, moving a new group of people as much as it was energizing the highly engaged people that were already kind of focused on that as a key component of what would make up their vote.
And again, for your campaign.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was,
again,
you know, we're on the other side of it, of course, but it became something that we knew that could be that thing that really excites a new group of people we did not see, or maybe a sleeping group of people, because there was something very relevant and very topical that was happening in the news media. That being said, you know, we were careful not to overreact. You know, there's a lot of steps that had to take that, you know, in McAuliffe advertising, they tried to, you know, make those steps a little bit tighter. Texas happened, so we'll have to defend it in our own constitution, kind of thing. You know, the question is, like, is that something that people feel viscerally is at risk immediately, and that will, you know, energize them? But, you know, kind of, I think what happened was halfway between the 2 points.
And just real quick to put, Michael, so is it your sense, I mean, even you think it worked with the people that you'd already captured, but it didn't really add to your momentum as you might have thought it would?
That was our, and there are other people that I'm sure have done more research on this nationally in Virginia in that moment as we looked at it. That specific, the Texas thing specifically, and, you know, the court prior to that agreeing that they were going, you know, saying they were going to take this up and they just did. But yeah, I think those two pieces added to intensity among a group that was already engaged. It just wasn't, there wasn't a new group of people or a new people that said, I wasn't worried about this before and now I am.
Let me shift to some local issues. June 22nd, Loudoun County School Board meeting had to be abruptly closed down after public testimony on the model transgender policy led to chaos and an arrest, and that was just, you know, one of many school boards across the Commonwealth facing angry parents. Will, what did that moment mean to your campaign? And I remember it was just days later that Glenn Youngkin came to Loudoun County to lay out his education plan. Yeah,
and we had started talking about education early. We never really wanted to cede that ground to the Democrats and, you know, allow us to be bludgeoned by it later on in the campaign. So we started talking about it early. When it comes to, you know, Loudoun County and the parental involvement, you know, you've got to look at that energy there and where is this, you know, you can look at polls, but where is this frustration coming from? And that's why, you know, the Parents Matter thing that I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit later, but, you know, you kind of see in it what you wanted in the fact that there was just a great deal of frustration, particularly on the part of parents, whether it was about COVID closings or whether it was about curriculum, that they were frustrated about, and that's something that we saw and thought that it would work really well with Glenn's message.
Mm-hmm. Actually, let's take since you're on that point right now, let's take a minute right here. The Parents Matter slogan, was that born out of that moment? Was it planned prior to that moment? When did that come to be?
We'd been banging some things around. I think it really crystallized around the debate, though, was, you know, we've really got to put a fine point on the sides here.
And we will come back to that in a minute too. Yeah.
So it was around there. It was, but, you know, we could feel this frustration, you know, at these school boards, and just people kind of feeling bullied around. That's what they were telling us, that they didn't feel like that, you know, their schools were being responsive to their concerns. So that's an advantage.
And Michael, what did your campaign make of what had happened that day in Loudoun County that really just kind of put a big spotlight on the frustration that was out there? I mean, did it make you start rethinking messaging at all, or how to focus on that?
I mean, I think the issue kind of as a whole, you know, through the point on education, I think is a fair one. I think there was starting frustration around, you know, probably around wearing masks, you know, school closures. I think generally coming out of COVID, there's a level of insecurity across the board because we live in a new reality in certain ways. I think that the specific kind of events that you're talking about, and when we looked at that, I think that it felt like there was a base of support that had already lived in the Republican Party and certainly could be, and I think likely was, one of the sources of energy. But I think that the notion that there were significant blocks of voters that were changing their mind or that were shifting party or vote shifting over, I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that.
So September 28th, red letter day for both campaigns. The second and final debate, Glenn Youngkin criticized Terry McAuliffe's veto of a bill that would have allowed parents to opt their children out of reading material that had sexually explicit content. And we all remember Terry McAuliffe responded first, yeah, I stopped that bill, and then he uttered the 12 infamous words, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. I know from listening to others in your campaign, within minutes, you were turning that into an ad.
Yeah, we had, you're always looking for, with the airwaves saturated with, back and forth. We were trying to run a positive campaign, but at this point, we've got to put some negatives on the air and get McAuliffe negatives up. And we were looking for some way to tap into this parental frustration without tying it to one specific thing or another. And generally it was, what side are you on, right? And that was a moment that we said, well, this is a clippable, this is not editorializing. This is not Glenn Youngkin saying that Terry's doing this or some disembodied voiceover saying that Terry believes this. This is Terry saying it. And we, I think we put it in 6 different ads. We had one up within hours and then started running it on TV as soon as we get to stations the next day. Because basically it was about, in our mind, it was about sides and people, like we talked about earlier, frustrated with the school administrators, and that sounded a lot like, hey, just let us handle it. I'm the pseudo incumbent, and the way that it's been going is the way it should keep going, and stop making all this noise. So, we thought that was pretty powerful.
And you were saying your phone was buzzing within minutes.
This
wasn't even
Twitter was telling me to make it into an ad before, we even had a script
Yeah.
written or anything. It was like, because I think people were just, people were watching on TV were just kind of jarred that something that concrete would come out.
Yeah. Michael, did it hit your campaign? There were a lot of other topics in that debate that night.
Yep.
Did it hit you right away as a gaffe? As something that you were going to have to worry about, or did that develop afterwards?
I think that it. So I'd say a couple things. One is the bill that was vetoed. I think Terry felt really strongly that veto was the right thing to do, and would do that again 10 times over again. Banning books and what that was about at its core. I think he fundamentally disagrees with. Other people may not, but I think that was. Some of these things have to be about integrity, and I think that was a place where he wasn't going to walk back the decision to veto that bill, nor should he. So I think there is that piece. I also, more broadly, as an issue, if this was as impactful and game-changing a moment that in this gaffe that was really going to shift things. Virginia had a shift from 2020 of 12 points. When you look at New York elections, 14 points. New Jersey, 14.5, maybe 15 points, and everything comes in. That is hard to argue that there was something unique that happened in that moment, that unless that moment reverberated to New Jersey and every other election in the country, it's tough to argue that moment was this huge shift. And it makes these conversations less interesting. It makes us admit, and I admit this all the time, that our relative power to influence things is very small. That there's a lot of money spent and all these things happen, but in the end of the day, it's about candidates, and far more often, it's about a broader kind of national mood that is moving one way or another. Maybe that tapped into a little bit, but again, there's no quantitative evidence that would suggest that, especially when you look nationally at these other races.
So observers might say that's a turning point, but not in your mind, not in the campaign's mind, and not you either.
I think we can
right?
agree on that point,
Yeah,
right?
interesting.
We are two pretty smart guys, but we can't move.
Okay.
Not
me.
We can't move hundreds of thousands of votes with a stroke of our pen or some micro-targeting or messaging campaign. It's more fun to talk about campaigns is it was one moment that changed everything. It's a little less boring to say, like, I mean, you saw it in the poll. We were on a march up, slow march up. Terry had started to drift. Things were starting to get close right around when we wanted it to. That helped bend the curve. But if we hadn't, started, we started on TV, 6 weeks before Terry did. I don't think if we had laid down this groundwork, then we would have been able to take advantage of this opportunity. If we were just some Republican who whoa, and jumped on a gaffe. There's moods and shifts that is beyond campaign operatives, and it's beyond candidates even.
So the next moment, though, could have put a bit of a halt to the march had it been handled differently. October 13th, Steve Bannon leads a rally in Henrico where participants say the Pledge of Allegiance to a flag that had been brought to the demonstrations at the Capitol the day of the invasion. Glenn Youngkin had a rally the next day in Warrenton. I was covering that, and we were all waiting to see what is he going to say. What was the discussion that led up to that decision about how he would address it?
It was a very short discussion. I think his quote on the record was, "It's weird and wrong," and that's what we went with because that's what he felt. Which
and those were his words, or was that a mutual decision?
We didn't have to poll test that. It's just I think that kind of refreshing honesty from Glenn, worked, right? Because if something's that obvious, you don't have to use a lot of words to try to get on both sides of something.
And Michael, in your campaign, were you thinking might be a moment for us, or again, just is that too much, putting too much emphasis on one thing?
No, I think it's. I mean, I don't think that there was ever a belief that any one moment was going to be a turning point. I think it's a game of a lot of quarter inches, and that felt like an opportunity to gain a quarter inch, reinforce something that we had been saying, and I think set up. I mean, Will brought this up before, but set up one of the kind of binary choices that you hope for on. Is someone that can, even in a less so than some people have, but to a certain extent embrace this person, or are you on the other side of that? And this was one of the opportunities I felt like to highlight it. The same way that I think in both cases, when there are moments like that, you do what you can. I think that for us, at least, in that moment, that was really about trying to expand the mobilization component. We were, like I mentioned at the top, we were very worried about turnout, and I think this was a way to kind of drive home the point that in a more visceral sense than we had before.
So done with the events. I'm going to turn to some other topics. Let's talk about the former president. Michael, I'm going to start this question with you. So, a number of political observers have said that they think Democrats may have erred by misreading anti-Trump resistance as support for them and their policies. I mean, what was the belief in the campaign about the effectiveness of frequently tying Glenn Youngkin to Donald Trump?
Well, I was thrilled Barack Obama was here. He's a fantastic former president. But on Trump, on the Trump piece, I mean, look, I think that Trump is to a certain extent a cultural signal that Democrats can use, and there are things that people find highly reprehensible, not just in terms of policy, although that's one piece of it, but also in terms of style and substance, or not substance, but like kind of personality, and I think that was important to do. I mean, if you look at from kind of where things ended up landing, margins in Loudoun County, margins in Prince William, some of these places that had recently kind of moved, or in the Trump years moved, we actually held margins in those counties that could have still produced an overall winning margin. Again, I think it was the overwhelming increase in Republican turnout, especially white non-college Republican turnout, that overwhelmed holding those margins. But I do think that using that as one of the components of what we were talking about to frame and give people an easy connection of this is the type of person this is, I think it was effective for that, and obviously could not be the only argument, but was one argument that was effective.
Will, different Donald Trump question for you. I think all of us covering the campaign wrote at one time or another these words: Mr. Youngkin is keeping Donald Trump at arm's length while trying to avoid alienating the forever Trumpers. How tricky did that tightrope walk get, especially in the final weeks?
Not terribly tricky. Like I said, we really try to focus on Virginia issues and not, run a campaign to the Chesterfield suburbs, to the Virginia Beach suburbs, to Hampton Roads, and not really kind of like the DC Twitterverse. I think people were kind of tired of, the everything being looked at as a referendum on Trump, and we saw the polling, we understood what they were doing. The question is instead of kind of falling into that trap and playing the, well, do you like him or do you not like him game, is there a way that we could shift the conversation onto safety, onto schools, onto cost of living, and try to focus on that? Because I think voters are smart and they know that they're electing a governor. It's a different deal when you're doing Senate or Congress, right? I mean, a governor is supposed to be responsible, for the executive, and people would see that as a distraction. As far as keeping him at arm's length, when he endorsed us, and he reminded us plenty of times, we accepted his endorsement, and wasn't much of a tap dance because honestly, it was not being brought up a lot with voters when we were on the ground. It sounds crazy to say, but it's a big deal on cable news. It's a big deal on Twitter. It wasn't a big deal in Chesterfield. Because Glenn was pretty clear and obvious about it. Thanks Trump for his support, and Trump's not on the ballot. Trump is not in office, so there's only so much that you can say. Okay, well, you have to address this this statement that he put out. Do we? So I think it was just a fine way of going. It wasn't too much trickery. We were just honest about it.
Michael Terry McAuliffe naturally had to talk about his record as governor from 2014 to 2018, but how did that need to talk about the past create a problem for, focusing on being a candidate in the future? I mean, a lot of people have said that he was sort of carried the mantle of a de facto incumbent, and that can be problematic when voters are in kind of a foul mood, as they were in this cycle. I mean, how did you evaluate that, and was that a little bit of a problem to deal with?
So I would say, a couple things. One, I think there were forward-looking elements that were presented, but more importantly, I think there have been a couple shifts that occurred during the Trump years. I mean, thinking back to pre-Trump years, legislative experience or executive experience in government was less valued. People were looking for more of the Youngkin type profile outside of politics, coming in to shake things up. And I think there was some reversion back to the mean of, actually, we do value government experience. We don't want another kind of president that's coming in with this kind of situation. So I think there was some move back to people having more value for that experience. Also, we're coming out of a relatively unprecedented time with, not relatively, an entirely unprecedented time with COVID. And steady leadership, steady hand, someone that's been there before with a record of both bipartisan accomplishment, but also, expanding voting rights, doing the right thing in our mind in tough situations sometimes. And I think that was one of the trademarks of the first term. We are proud of that and wanted to talk about it. I don't think that was necessarily damaging. I do think that when you're dealing with a broader, nationally, Democrats in control for the first time, at least in the executive office in 4 years, for a lot of people that voted starting in 2016, that was the first time, or those 4 years were the first years that they had ever voted for a Democrat. There were a lot of voters who were, probably Romney voters and everything else. We've seen those shifts occur, and vice versa. There are Democrats that probably voted for Republicans for the first time. I think that was a bar that needed to get passed, and I think that there was the national environment and mood certainly played a lot more, I think, into kind of how people were viewing Democrats as a brand than just Terry's record as governor and what he was presenting in terms of looking forward.
Yeah, I mean, if I could build off that, our first ad at the General was, Glenn walking through a field of, we call them zombies, career politicians. We ended it with a kind of a redo of that same ad, and that, wasn't a mistake. There's a triple D situation in Richmond, triple D situation in DC. We're an outsider. It's right there. We've got to run as, shaking things up because, and force them to defend, the record. So we really wanted that to be the frame, because if the frame was Republican versus Democrat, and that's it, then we don't win that fight. So we have to, we try to reframe it as quickly as we could.
One more question here before we turn to audience questions. Will, even though very few voters, much less candidates, could accurately define critical race theory, CRT was featured prominently in the Youngkin campaign. How did the campaign evaluate the potential CRT had for motivating GOP voters against the risk of further stoking racial division in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, well, I'm going to kind of push back on the premise there. We ran 40 ads on TV, $30 million. Not one of them said critical race theory.
Every speech did, and it was the biggest applause line in every speech.
Glenn was talking about it on the trail, and I think that this is one of the blunders of Democrats generally, not saying anything about the McAuliffe campaign, but the response to this, which, this idea that it was a completely made up Fox News, joke, was false. I mean, this was on government websites. This was on, best practices. Terry McAuliffe had put it on in 2015. There was not a critical race theory textbook being handed out, but it was there, and everybody knew that there was something there. And it kind of became larger. It became, kind of a more specific way to talk about what I said before, bullying, lack of control over the curriculum, and people feeling that they did not have control over what their kids were being exposed to in the curriculum in their public schools.
We're going to dive into some audience questions now.
Sure.
Some of these came in online, some from the room. Let's start from one. This is one that came online, and it has to do with technology in the campaign. Can you give us one example of a technological innovation that was deployed with success in the campaign, something that we're likely to read about in Campaigns and Elections magazine, if we read that magazine? I have to confess, I'm not a subscriber.
Me neither.
Go ahead.
Anything jump out at either of you?
So I can mention I guess a few things. One approach the McAuliffe campaign took that I thought was smart is a lot of the digital platforms have made buying on those platforms more efficient and easier to do. Easier to manage large campaigns, and and I'm sure this has happened on other races as well, although I don't think it's super common. We didn't have a digital media vendor. We had a digital media team that was in-house that, if there was something that happened, they could have an ad, up on digital platforms. 30 minutes later, we ended up running some of those ads on TV because they were high-quality, good ads. They were all high-quality, good ads. But so that also allowed for an amazing amount of responsiveness in terms of vote by mail chase, in terms of early voting, but then also rapid response, news boosting through Facebook. It just led to a more kind of dynamic digital approach that wasn't a new technology, but I think as a result of these major companies offering more user-friendly buying opportunities, it doesn't require someone that has a PhD in media buying. You're able to train people relatively quickly and run successful campaigns that way. You also are reducing or eliminating commission, which on major media buys can get to be expensive.
And you might not want to answer that question, but what were you most?
I didn't bring you in.
What were you most proud of in terms of something that you felt like you did that was innovative?
Yeah, I think let's see that. I'd say one high and one low. Not very technical, but I think we ran a lot of 60-second TV commercials, where the typical, your scientifically best unit is a 30-second ad. We ran a couple of 60 seconds. I know that you guys ran a couple as well. That kind of tell a little bit more of a story. Our intro ad at the very beginning of the campaign was 60 seconds long to go through Glenn's bio and to build up his positives as somebody who was local, somebody who worked his way up from the bottom, from somebody who played basketball, that kind of deal. So we kind of took a risk because you're cutting your frequency in half when you do a 60-second ad for the same amount of money. But we kind of wanted to tell a story because we knew we had to get people to know the real Glenn. Another on the other side of things, I would say just generally the micro-targeting and not taking any vote, not leaving any votes on the field. And there's a huge opportunity with OTT, a lot of like Roku and Hulu and this kind of targeting that you can find folks. I mean, we had El Salvadorians for Youngkin, so we can find them, we can give them catered messages, and you can do it with a very little amount of waste. Whereas, you're buying broadcast or even cable, you're wasting a lot of what you're talking about. As I'm sure that you guys saw in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, you're getting ads for people you couldn't vote for if you wanted to, so trying to avoid that.
This audience question, Will, I think goes to you. What did you do to boost turnout so significantly in the rural parts of the state?
I got to give this one to Glenn. That guy works like crazy. I mean, 18-hour days, no days off. He would just work it. Bus tour. He did a lot of events. He'd do a lot of quick rallies and keep moving. We tried to touch, events where people already were and get people rallied up. So I'm gonna. That was the secret weapon we had was Glenn Youngkin.
Michael, I'll send this one to you. Not exactly a softball here. Why didn't you attack or define Youngkin earlier? After the convention, you let him control the early narrative and he got traction. Audience question for you.
Interesting. I mean, so I guess I'd say if we're talking about TV specifically, which I think it must be because we, were even prior to the convention, posting up against Youngkin, and definitively, I think for our primary, thought that was a helpful component to have, kind of a Republican counterpoint to talk about. So online and certainly through Earned and everything else, we had started that. There were a set of different kind of rumors out there. We saw on the slide that Youngkin had spent $20 million of his own money. Someone probably had the capacity if he, I don't know his personal finances, but could have potentially spent more. We believed he was likely to spend more, and frankly didn't know at that point kind of what our trajectory would be in terms of dollars. So I think there was a decision to that extent. We also did a consistent monitoring. Typically at that point in a campaign, you would not be in the field kind of testing where things stand week to week. We were, because I think there was a fear that are we going to see positives jump up? Are we going to see some other issue? We saw positives move up. We saw negatives on Youngkin move up at the same rate. And I think these are one of these things that much later on you can litigate what the impact of those 4 or 5 weeks were. It's again, like you look at New Jersey, you look at some of these other states, hard to argue definitively that was like the moment or that was the thing, maybe. But I don't think we saw it that way. And I think there's a lot of debate back and forth. I also think generally the more important time to be spending more than your opponent or outspending your opponent is over the last 3-4 weeks of the campaign. We wanted to make sure that was happening, or at least during the early voting period.
And you did.
And for large part, we were able to do that. Yeah.
So no surprise on your end that there wasn't more incoming earlier.
I was surprised. I wonder what you guys are doing. Not like I'm saying it's obvious or anything, but we do look. He was at 8%. Name ID, and half those people were lying. So we knew that we had to we just had to get started earlier. Terry McAuliffe was a governor, and I think that in hindsight, things can look a little more obvious. Let's go back to the beginning. I mean, he had just Terry McAuliffe had just walloped his pretty serious primary opponents in every county in Virginia. He had money, he had name ID. This was not something that we looked at as like, oh, this is going to be down to the wire. This is going to be a challenge. So we thought, look, we've got to do what we can to get some sort of head start on him. And we know, based on McAuliffe's pedigree, that he was going to come out not nasty, but he was going to come out negative, and it was going to be tough, and he was going to try to define us quickly. So we figured, hey, let's roll the dice and see if we can get people to, like I said, Glenn Youngkin's secret weapon. He's great on camera. He seems like a very nice Northern Virginia basketball dad. So it's like, let's get that out there and get people to have some kind of good feeling about him before bombs start dropping.
Another audience question related to turnout. This person asks, do you see participation in future elections increasing, or was this unique due to the fact that these candidates themselves caused the increase? What do you see on the horizon?
I mean, I think I don't think there's ever one thing. Turnout over time, I certainly hope. I think more people voting just as an American is a good thing. I think we could all agree to that. So I hope the turnout gets to 100%. Whether there's a trend that moves in that direction or not, certainly there's a high level of engagement right now, and it seems like that will continue at least over the next few years. I also think there was an exorbitant amount of money that was spent in the state, and I think there were two candidates that spoke strongly to bases of their party, and I think we saw again a similar effect nationally, which would mean that Americans are engaged in a different way. In this occasion, that wasn't the result certainly that I wanted, but overall I would say more people voting is a good thing, and we should all encourage that and hope that that's the case.
What's your thought about moving forward? Does this set? I mean, does it set a new bar that could continue? Absolutely, can't guess.
I don't really know. I would say the same thing, which is I think that this is good involvement. It was fun to see folks that maybe had not been participating, some low propensity voters who were getting animated by this issue. But I don't think it's by the education issue. But I don't think that this just falls away. There'll be something else in the next campaign.
We've sort of touched on this a little bit, but Will, audience member wants to know, did it actually help Glenn Youngkin that he had no previous experience in elective office?
Yeah, there's no record to criticize. So yeah, absolutely. Particularly people want to change. People don't like the direction of either the country or the state. And you put up a candidate who has been successful in another sector of life. We knew that was, that would resonate with people, and we would also not have to take incoming on, certain votes or certain positions for the past. Sure.
And Michael, by the same token, I mean, having an opponent that doesn't have a record, it's got to be tough.
I think it's always a different challenge, and I think that there were Glenn Youngkin had a lot of strengths. I think that his message discipline, and some other pieces like that were certainly made him certainly a better candidate than Ken Cuccinelli. The thing I would say is in the last week I've been through 100,000 different rabbit holes or rat holes or whatever you want to call it, thinking about every little different thing that could have happened. But in one of those rabbit holes or rat holes, I looked at 2010, 2014, other situations where there was a broader kind of national element that was impacting outcomes. And what created anomalous results in those situations was candidates that were, the Sharon Ingalls. I mean, you look at Harry Reid's race in Nevada, or you look at Delaware, and like some of these other situations where there were, of the opposing party, in this case Republicans, that were well outside of even the realm of reality. Those created the kind of anomalous outcomes where typically in politics these things move in waves. And I think that that Youngkin did not, did not play the role of one of those really anomalous candidates.
You're talking about, the rabbit holes and the post-mortem. I mean, what have you struck on that you wish you would have done differently, might have done differently?
It's a good question. I mean, look, I think that I think there, like I mentioned before, I think there are. It's always a game of quarter inches. I think what makes it so tough is measurement in these kinds of situations is a really difficult thing. When you're raising money online, you can measure pretty easily, we're spending this money and it's returning this money. I know what I'm getting, and so I'm going to spend this amount until my ROI maxes out. Same thing if you're selling things online or anything like that. Trying to understand when there is, when someone makes up their mind or what is in their mind before they put the mail ballot in the mail or go vote in person. There is, no technology that I have seen that's been able to quantify that. And so understanding that, hey, if we'd done this differently, would that have potentially created this other reaction though? Or would this other thing not have happened that would have changed something else? Or did a lot of this, did we have little impact on all of this when you look at, again, these national results? My sense is it's probably that. But I think it's impossible to quantify. So, it's a dark space at night, but nothing that I've come up with is like, here's the thing.
As we start to wind down, a couple lighter topics, but it seems like yard signs have to come up every time after the vote. But there was a resurgence in yard signs thanks to the Glenn Youngkin campaign.
Yes.
Was the yard sign blitz kind of a plan from the beginning, or how did that evolve? And how convinced are you of their effectiveness?
I mean, you don't. I was going to bring that up as like the new technology that we took advantage of. No, I mean, this is one of the benefits of having an outsider first-time candidate. He really wanted yard signs, and you can't, all of us snake-bitten old, political consultants who have, we look down at yard signs because it's a waste of resources, it's a waste of staff time. He wanted them, and he wanted nice ones, and we said, heck yes. But one thing I will say is that you started seeing them in yards that these weren't Trump yards, right? And this is what we were looking for, was that permission slip for an independent voter, for a Biden voter, for a Northam voter to say, okay, I'm coming back over. Because, and if in a neighborhood, people had the guts to say, I'm voting Republican again, that we knew that would kind of have some social, allowance to at least listen to Glenn's message and not just say, well, is he this bucket or that bucket? And then once they could hear the message, they'd see it as very local and very, something that touched their lives multiple times a week. And again, this is a governor's race, right? So.
And we can't end without asking about the red vest.
Oh man.
Are we going to see those across the country now in campaigns?
I think. We joked about it. My partner Tim O'Toole and I at the firm, like when some of our first shoots. I mean, Glenn, again with the yard signs, he liked the swag, and it was cool swag, and he wanted to wear it. And we were like, well, it's kind of like you don't wear the band shirt of the band you're going to. It's like you're not going to run for governor with a vest with your name on it. And it's like, yeah, I think it's great. It's like, okay, he's the boss. Like, let's see how it goes. So, it worked because it's just like Glenn, some like that kind of brutal honesty and earnestness kind of played well. It definitely wasn't a consultant manufactured image. It was like, this is Glenn.
Well, that is sadly going to be our final word for this segment. But our great thanks to both of you, Will Ritter, Michael Halle. Thanks for the deep dive. Thanks for your honesty, and we appreciate you so much being part of After the Vote. Thanks.
Thanks for everything, Vpap, guys.
Thank you, Vpap. Yeah.
I'm going to teach you how to do the video part.
Okay. Hi, Jessica. I'm learning how to post a video.
Hey, Patrick. This is Delvin. I'm a volunteer for Cox. I'm calling to see how you're doing today.
Mom! Oh my God, I'm about to cry.
Don't worry, Gracie. With the help of technology, they were able to turn their canceled school play
into an original animated film
that took things to a whole new level.
I honestly can't believe that we did that.
That is incredible.
I love that. That's me. I'm cute.
You don't know how much this means to me. Thank you, Gary.
Love it.
In these divided times, people are less willing to trust what they read, particularly when it comes to politics. In Virginia, there's a fiercely nonpartisan group that takes a different approach. The Virginia Public Access Project, known as Vpap, is a nonprofit that organizes verifiable facts so you can see for yourself and reach your own conclusions. Our premise is simple, that an informed electorate is key to a vibrant democracy. We don't lobby or take positions on the issues. We are committed to accuracy. Our mission is to elevate public understanding by presenting factual information in ways that are easily understood and free of partisan bias. Our services are free and available to anyone. We are funded by our users who come from across the political spectrum. See for yourself at vpap.org, where you can follow the money, track legislation, understand your community's demographics, and receive a daily list of political headlines, from Galax to Fairfax. VPAP's work is made possible by donors like you. Thank you.
Welcome back to After Virginia Votes. I am now joined by our distinguished academic commentators from VPAP's two higher education partners in After Virginia Votes. We're going to look ahead to see what Tuesday's election means for the upcoming General Assembly session, for redistricting, and for the 2022 midterms. So welcome now to Mark Rozell. He is Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and Quentin Kidd, the Academic Director of the Wason Center for Civic Leadership at Christopher Newport University. Thanks for joining us, both of you. Let's start with a look at redistricting. So in the redistricting commission debates this fall, Democrats insisted that fair maps would show Virginia as +10, as a +10 Democratic state. But how is the GOP sweep likely to reframe what fair is as that issue comes before the state Supreme Court? Mark?
Well, I think D +10 is a bit much. Maybe we're a D +4, +5. More realistically, and certainly this election cycle showed that this is not a D +10 state. So, yeah, the Republicans, of course, will define what is fair very differently. And there is a debate going on right now and a controversy over appointees to a redistricting commission and whether this is being done in a nonpartisan fashion. So, Political parties all the time will try to game this to their advantage as much as they can. It's always been that way. Virginia made an attempt to do something nonpartisan that fell apart, so we have to start over. Maybe we'll be doing the elections over again next year too.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Quentin, Ken, what do you think? I mean, how does this start to shift the perception? I mean, it's in the hands of the court, so how much influence can be brought to bear?
Yeah, the court, I think less influence can be brought to bear than the parties might like. At this point, I think the court is likely to basically draw lines that protect incumbents. Minor shifts around the edges, minimal partisan damage on either side, and then send it back to the General Assembly to try to fix or try to amend or try to do whatever they're going to do. If not, then those maps essentially are what will drive Virginia for the next 10 years. But clearly, to Mark's point, the idea of trying something new and innovative in Virginia to get towards something that was less partisan has collapsed.
So Glenn Youngkin's going to arrive in Richmond sort of as a political newcomer, really. Do you think that Governor-elect Youngkin is going to continue to focus on some of the cultural issues he brought up during the campaign, or do you think, especially in this first legislative session, he'll really zero in on those kitchen table issues that he talked quite a bit about? Mark, want to take that first?
Start? Yeah. I think probably he's going to focus more on the kitchen table issues. He showed his hand in this campaign that he was not in the Trump camp of the Republican Party. He signaled just enough to Trump Republicans on some key issues, particularly in the nomination process. But later on, he really did talk mostly about bread and butter issues. Eliminating the sales tax on groceries, temporarily eliminating the gasoline tax to give people relief, potentially lowering the state income tax. Education issues, which did rise to much higher significance in the last month or so of the campaign, the polling data showed. I think he was intensely focused on those kinds of issues, and he just did barely enough, I think, to keep the social conservatives and the Trump followers in his fold, and probably Terry McAuliffe's own campaign that focused so much on characterizing Youngkin as a Trump acolyte did the work for the Trump campaign of assuring the Trump voters that Glenn Youngkin is their man without Glenn Youngkin having to do it himself. It worked beautifully for him.
Interesting observation. Quentin, Kidd, what do you expect to see from Glenn Youngkin right out of the box legislatively?
More bread and butter issues. Let's not forget, Democrats still control the Virginia Senate, even though we have our own version of Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. The Democrats still. So there's some limits to what he could do on social issues. There's some limits. I think a lot of limits on what he could do to roll back some of the things Republicans really don't like about what Democrats have done the last couple of years. But there's bipartisan support for some things like eliminating the grocery tax, for example. Right. And so, if you're a new governor, you're learning how to be governor. You want some wins, some early wins, and some bipartisan wins would be good for him. So I'd expect the path to be the bread and butter path. There will be skirmishes on the edges on social issues, but again, I think there's a very real limit as to what he could do in that arena, even if he wanted to go down that path.
And he's got the appointment power too. He can appoint social conservatives, people more loyal to the sort of Trump wing of the Republican Party, to various boards and the like, to showcase that he's not ignoring them, but still focus in policy on the bread and butter issues.
So just real quickly, I mean, we know there will be House Republicans that will bring forward some sort of bill to further limit abortion.
Yeah.
I mean, how much do you expect him to put any weight behind that?
I would imagine he will stay out of the way unless it gets through the legislature.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why get involved in something like that if it's not likely to get through the legislature anyway? But back for a moment, remember what his day one promise is: getting rid of mask mandates, getting rid of vaccination mandates. I mean, so those are in that arena of social issues.
That's right.
And so he can do some things through sort of executive action, and avoid the legislature and the roadblocks that he might see in the legislature.
Yeah, good point. Glad you brought that up. Let's talk about the Democrats for a minute. And Mark, I've heard you talk about this in the last week. You know, did they overreach in the General Assembly last year, thinking that 2019 was an endorsement of them and their, fairly liberal policies for Virginia, rather than a repudiation of Donald Trump?
Right. So winners of political campaigns all the time overread their mandate from the voters. They always believe that their great ideas have been affirmed by the voters and that they can now do what they said they would do in the campaign. And we all know this in Virginia, what happened for 4 years. Anti-Trump vote. People with an R next to their name got wiped out of offices across the Commonwealth during the Trump era. It was an anti-Trump surge that helped the Democratic Party come to the position of total dominance in Virginia. And I think by pushing an aggressively progressive agenda over those 4 years, even though individually, issue by issue, there was some significant support in the public for them, the perception became that the Democrats had gone too far, too fast. And I think there was a counter reaction to that ultimately.
Agree, they overplayed their hand?
Yeah, I do. I call what we've experienced over the last 4.5 years a Trump inflationary bubble. It was a Trump inflationary bubble of 4 or 5 percentage points. The bubble burst, and the bubble burst in this election. And I don't know that it was all driven by, I would agree that there's a sentiment that Democrats may have over, but I also think the bubble burst in part because of the national mood. Right. The bubble burst in New Jersey, the bubble burst in New York. So it was more than just what Democrats had done in Virginia. I think there was a larger sort of, I think voters are tired of Trump. They want to move beyond from Trump. And to Mark's earlier point, the McAuliffe campaign may have done the Youngkin campaign a favor by focusing on Trump as much as they did, because voters are sick of Trump.
The Democratic brand was suffering. I mean, with the declining popularity of the president, what happened in Afghanistan, the crisis at the border, inflation, and then I suppose ironically, the declining of the surge of the Delta variant reduced the impact of the coronavirus issue as a key issue in this campaign. So the polling that we did with the Washington Post showed that that issue declined in significance, substantially in the last weeks of the campaign, and that was a big McAuliffe advantage issue. Yeah. So perhaps ironically that the virus surge was handled so well in Virginia that the issue started to disappear in the minds of Virginians while that was being done during a Democratic administration, and Terry McAuliffe lost a big advantage issue in the campaign that he had had.
Yeah, and of course that poll showed as COVID concerns declined, the education issue rose much higher, and economy obviously always a concern. Now that Republicans have regained control of the House after 2 years in the minority, how do you think they'll try to reestablish their brand, and will it be different than what we've seen before? Want to start with that, Quentin?
So the question is, what is their brand? So I think among the things Republicans may have figured out how to do is how to deal with their factions. They use that ranked choice vote at the convention to sort of sideline the Trump wing, but those delegates are still in the legislature, and the issues that they care about are still there. And so the real outstanding question for me is, what is the Republican brand in the House of Delegates right now? And I don't know the answer to that right now. Glenn Youngkin, again, was able to speak to sort of the Trump base and white evangelicals just enough to get them excited, but he seems more bread and butter, more basic economic conservative to me, and so I'm not sure what the answer is.
How much do they model their brand after Glenn Youngkin?
Right. Yeah, I think that's key. And by the way, that's a really important point, that the Republicans had this distributed convention with ranked choice voting that enabled the party to nominate somebody who's actually electable, right? So you have these primaries, or closed conventions where you have a smaller, more intensified activist base participating that is not reflective of the general voting population, even among Republicans, and you get these outlier candidates who can't win general elections. So I think they did themselves well to have that. Will this be modeled in other campaigns? I think so. You know, the way he sort of straddled that, you know, Trump wing and then the mainstream of the Republican Party at the same time, you know, that tightrope act you mentioned. A lot of people thought the Trump followers would sit on their hands on Election Day unless Glenn Youngkin did everything on all the issues that they care about. And he didn't do that, and he was able to hold those voters. I mean, the poll that we had showed 99% of Trump 2020 voters were for Youngkin, and 89% of Biden 2020 voters were for McAuliffe. That to me was huge, showing that he solidified the Trump base in the Republican Party without having to do too much on their issues, and they let him do what he had to do in order to win. They didn't push him and say, be 100% on 100% of our issues all the time, or we're going to walk or sit on our hands on Election Day. And you didn't have Trump. Yeah, he kind of hinted at it at one point, but he didn't go that far. You know, trying to say that Youngkin's not going far enough, and he better be, you know, with my movement, or else he's going to lose.
And Amanda Chase walked away for about 6 weeks.
Yes.
After the convention, which I think really helped Youngkin.
In that time that he was defining himself for Virginians.
Yeah, right.
And I'm going to drill down more, you know, again on the look ahead at the midterms in a minute, but sticking with the General Assembly for a minute longer, how do you think each political caucus now is looking at the prospect of perhaps having elections again next year? I mean, they hadn't even counted the votes hardly before that buzz started, that we could be doing this again in fall of 2022.
The real challenge, I mean, I'm sure that the consultants love it. The candidates are probably thinking, what in the world have I got myself into? The challenge here is 45 days unrestricted early voting. So the DC media market is a little bit more expensive, but if you live in the Richmond media market, the Hampton Roads media market, Charlottesville, Roanoke, Lynchburg, you saw delegates on TV 5, 6, 7 weeks out. You don't see delegates on TV that far out normally, but that's the new normal in Virginia, and that costs a lot of money. You know, so House delegates races that in the past would be $125,000, $150,000, $200,000 are now $500,000. $500,000 campaigns are now $1 million campaigns, because they've got to be on TV. And so this is 3 years in a row that they're going to have to do this.
We have one race about $4.5 million, right? The 10th district.
Right,
I mean, it's like a congressional race now. Some of these House of Delegates races, it's unbelievable.
And it wasn't so long ago where I can remember 15 years ago or so, where we hit the first $1 million state Senate race. And you know.
What do you both think that was the likelihood that, and again, this is going to be, you know, this will probably come to the court, but the likelihood of elections again next year? House of Delegates elections.
Very high.
I think it's going to happen.
High.
Yeah, count on it.
Wow.
3 years in a row.
Wow.
That's what I think.
House of Delegates elections
and
in
I think
Virginia.
the last time that happened was back in the early
1980s. 1980,
yeah.
the census of 1980 caused the same sort of thing.
That's okay. So looking ahead to the midterm, boy, that caused a buzz in the room too. Nobody wants to think about that.
There's no rest for the weary in Virginia. Just, you know.
Virginia is called the permanent employment for political scientists state.
Yes, there you go.
And journalists, yeah. So looking ahead to the midterms, so you started to talk about it, Mark. To what degree has the Glenn Youngkin campaign created a nationwide playbook for GOP candidates in 2022? I mean, which chapters can be duplicated and applied, or which were really just written for a Virginia audience, or were just due to his strong capabilities as a candidate?
Right. So I think one important fact is that this is going to tell many Republicans in places around the country where people had said Republicans can't compete, that they can compete now. If you can win in Virginia, blue trending state, hasn't elected a Republican statewide in 12 years, it's still demographically a blue leaning state, you know, despite what happened in the election. I think that sends a strong signal, and it will activate a lot of enthusiasm, I think, in the grassroots and help these candidates raise money. And I think many will be looking at the Youngkin campaign as an exercise to study about how to, you know, sort of straddle that difficult line with holding the Trump base and yet expanding to, win independent and swing voters, which he did. I mean, he he won the independent voters by 8 percentage points while holding the Trump base, and that's what people said couldn't be done. It was done.
Right. Quentin, his team, though, likes to say that a lot of this is credit to a high-quality candidate. So, that's why I ask about the duplication in other places. Is it, is a lot of this just because of who Glenn Youngkin is?
So what Glenn Youngkin has that probably most other candidates aren't going to have is a deep pocket. He is smart as a whip. He's a fast learner. All of those things now, not that any other candidate out there might not be smart and a fast learner, but there are lots of congressional districts around the country, in suburban Kansas City, suburban Denver, the western side of Philly, that look like Virginia politically, that Republicans must be looking at now and saying, there's a path. We can see this path through. The question is, can we find the candidate that can walk that path, who has arms long enough to embrace the sort of middle of the electorate, but still sort of be able to rub the shoulder of the Trump voter. So it clearly is a lesson for candidates out there. Now, we probably aren't going to see everybody wearing red vests and things like that, but they'll find their own things.
But it might help the GOP start to move beyond Trump a little bit more.
I was going to say what might be real different though is if Trump decides that he's going to run, so Trump was in a unique position here. He's sort of marginalized in a way that he's never been marginalized, and it's too soon to say I'm going to run again. People are encouraging him not to say that. 10 months from now, Trump may be an announced candidate for president in 2024, and his new media empire may be, having him out all over the place, and the dynamic may change a little bit. And so, I think the general lesson of the Youngkin win is still there, but the dynamic of Trump himself may look different.
And looking more closely at that specific lesson as it relates to Donald Trump, which you both touched on a little bit, just to talk about it a little bit more though. So has Glenn Youngkin charted a path for this new sort of middle ground? And so you suggest maybe it will embolden other candidates if the landscape doesn't change too much. I mean, what do you think about that? Has he shown the way to some others? But will they?
Not in a place like Alabama or particular congressional districts in Texas, but there are a lot of congressional districts that look like Virginia. Look, if I'm a Republican, I'm looking at who do we nominate in the 2nd congressional district here in Virginia, or in the 7th? Those two districts are almost smack dab in the middle of the ideological spectrum in Congress. Whoever Republicans nominate in those districts should, get the Youngkin playbook and study it seriously.
And the places that look like Virginia are the ones that matter. So Alabama's not going to matter, right? You can run as a Trump acolyte or whatever they call them, and that's great. You're gonna win. But the places that look more like Virginia, the sort of purple swing areas of the country, sure. I think it is a model.
Yeah. Let's look at Democrats. What do Democratic candidates learn from this race, and what do you think, discovering about how they need to retool their message?
Have a forward-looking campaign, have a positive campaign that tells people what difference you're going to make in their lives if you're elected, and make that be more the focus than running a campaign that was so 2017, 18, 19, and 20, which is what people tended to see very much come from the McAuliffe campaign in this latest election cycle. The anti-Trump message was not as powerful with a diminished former president who is not on the ballot and not in the White House. And I just know a lot of people who were in Terry McAuliffe's camp who were just saying,
underwhelmed.
Move beyond that and start. You have a record as governor. You did a lot of good things. They said, why is that not coming across more strongly than it is in this campaign?
So there, if you'll go back in your mind's eye to the article in the Washington Post where Terry McAuliffe announces he's running for governor, the picture, 3 black women, Senator Louise Lucas, LeVar Stoney, the mayor, elementary school as a backdrop, the signage on the podium, our children, our schools, our future.
Yeah, that's it.
I don't know where that Terry McAuliffe went toward the end of the campaign.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is the issue. and this was probably the worst environment for Democrats since 2009. 2014 could have turned out like this for Mark Warner. I mean, but for a few things, different. Ed Gillespie says, "Look, if I had another week, we would have beat him." So part of it is larger environment, but part of it is sort of what you do. And I've had any number of people say, "What happened to Terry McAuliffe sometime in early August when he stopped talking about the things he was talking about? He started talking about Donald Trump." I think that image of his announcement really says a lot, because Democrats lost ground among black women voters. They lost the issue of education. The Youngkin campaign took that issue, and that was literally what he announced on in front of an elementary school with that signage on the podium.
And actually, this is one area where I disagree with the previous panel. I think the education issue was key in this election. The Washington Post Schar School poll in September showed that it was down among the list of issues that people cared the most about, but it was a huge McAuliffe advantage issue. And then the late October poll that we did with the Washington Post showed it was the number one issue, and McAuliffe's advantage had completely disappeared. So to me, that was a defining moment, that debate. That did change the trajectory of the campaign.
And I don't think the gaffe, those 12 words, 14 words, I don't think that didn't shape anything. It crystallized, I think, things in the minds of voters.
It's reinforced.
It reinforced what was going on already. This shift, this losing ground on the issue of education.
I think it threw jet fire on it, actually. So we may disagree on that point. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thanks so much to both of you. I would like to thank all of our speakers tonight, Michael Halle, Will Ritter, Dr. Quentin Kidd, and Dr. Mark Rozell. We also want to thank our host, the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, Cox Communications, and all the other sponsors whose support made this annual program possible. We have recorded this conversation, so if you want to check in with it again or share it with friends, you can find it tomorrow at vpap.org. Thanks for joining us, and good evening, everyone.
Yes.